Alright, Reddit, buckle up, because you won't believe the garbage I had to deal with this week. I'm Troy Johnson, and I live in a pretty nice suburban neighborhood, or at least, it would be nice if not for my neighbor, Karen Crawford. Now, before you roll your eyes and think, another Karen story. Yawn, trust me, this one's got a twist. I've lived in this house for 5 years, saved up every penny, and finally have a little slice of the American dream, a well-maintained lawn, a decent shed, and, most importantly, a beautiful in-ground pool in my backyard. The pool was the reason I bought the house. After grinding day in and day out, I wanted a place to relax, to invite friends over, to just escape. But Karen apparently thinks my pool is community property. It started subtly, a few accidental volleyballs bouncing over the fence, followed by her asking to retrieve them. Then came the overly friendly waves and the casual conversations across the property line. I'm a friendly guy, so I engaged, thinking nothing of it. Big mistake. It escalated slowly but surely. First, she started commenting on how refreshing the pool looked on hot days. Then she began stopping by, ostensibly to chat, but really just to linger near the fence, eyeing my carefully curated oasis. Then came the brazen requests. Oh, Troy, it's just so hot today. Mind if I take a quick dip? I politely declined, of course. The first few times, anyway. I tried to be diplomatic, explaining that it was a liability issue, that I preferred to keep it for my guests and myself, that I just valued my privacy. But Karen is a force of nature, a Category 5 hurricane of entitlement. My polite refusals only seemed to fuel her resolve. She started showing up in her bathing suit, towel draped over her shoulder, as if it were a foregone conclusion that she was entitled to a swim. I started avoiding her, hiding inside when I saw her emerge in her swimwear. I even put up a privacy screen, which she promptly complained about, saying it blocked her sunlight. You can't win, right? The last straw was last weekend. I was having a cookout with some friends, grilling burgers and blasting some tunes. Karen strolled over, uninvited, and helped herself to a burger. Then, without even asking, she just jumped in the pool, splashing my friends and generally making a nuisance of herself. I was beyond furious. I asked her to leave, politely at first, then with considerably less politeness. She huffed and puffed about how I was being unneighborly, and how she just wanted to cool off. I finally had to practically drag her out of the pool, dripping and indignant. That was it. I decided I was done. I couldn't enjoy my own property because of her. After the cookout debacle, I knew something had to change. I couldn't keep living like this, held hostage in my own home by Karen's ridiculous entitlement. So, I hatched a plan. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't subtle, but it was effective. I decided to close the pool for the season. Now, it was only mid-July, prime swimming season, but I was willing to sacrifice a few months of poolside relaxation for some peace of mind. I drained the pool, covered it with a heavy-duty tarp, and secured it with industrial-strength bungee cords. I also put up a sign that read, "Pool closed for maintenance." The next morning, I was out in the yard, double-checking the tarp, when I saw Karen emerge from her house, her eyes immediately scanning the backyard. Her face went through a series of emotions, confusion, disbelief, and then, pure, unadulterated rage. She stormed over to the fence, her voice rising with each step. "Troy! What in the world do you think you're doing?" I sighed, bracing myself for the inevitable confrontation. "Good morning, Karen. As the sign says, the pool is closed for maintenance." Maintenance? In the middle of summer? Don't give me that garbage. You're doing this because of me, aren't you? She practically shrieked. "Karen, I'm doing this because I need to do some repairs. The liner needs some work, and I want to get it done before winter. It's my pool, and I can close it whenever I want." I tried to keep my voice calm, but I could feel my blood pressure rising. She wasn't buying it. You're just being spiteful. I have a right to use that pool. This neighborhood needs a community pool, and you're hoarding it all to yourself. I almost laughed. A right? Karen, I pay the mortgage, I pay the property taxes, I pay for the upkeep. You have no right to anything on my property. The argument escalated from there. She accused me of being selfish, unreasonable, and even, wait for it, racist. Yes, you read that right. According to Karen, closing my pool was a racially motivated act because, well, I honestly couldn't follow her logic. It involved something about denying her access to the finer things in life, and how I was perpetuating stereotypes. It was so absurd that it was almost comical. Almost. I tried to disengage, to walk away, but she wouldn't let me. She kept yelling, her voice attracting the attention of other neighbors. I saw Mrs. Henderson from across the street peeking out from behind her curtains. Embarrassed and frustrated, I finally snapped. Karen, leave me alone. This is my property. Go back to your own house and leave me in peace. That's when she pulled out her phone. Fine. I'm calling the police. You're harassing me. You're denying me access to a community resource. You'll be sorry, Troy Johnson. I scoffed. Go ahead, Karen. Call the police. They're going to laugh in your face. I honestly didn't think she would. It was such a ridiculous complaint. But boy, was I wrong. I watched, dumbfounded, as Karen dialed 911, her voice dripping with fake distress. She told the operator some convoluted story about how I was depriving her of her basic rights, how I was being aggressive and threatening, and how I was creating a hostile environment. I could hear snippets of her conversation, and I just shook my head in disbelief. I walked back into my house, figuring the police would arrive, assess the situation, and tell Karen to stop wasting their time. I made myself a glass of iced tea and waited, trying to calm my nerves. It took about 15 minutes for the police to arrive. 2 officers pulled up in separate cruisers, and I felt a sliver of relief. Surely, they would see how ridiculous this was. I walked out to meet them, trying to appear calm and reasonable. Karen was standing at the fence, arms crossed, a smug look on her face. Officer, I said, addressing the taller of the two, I'm Troy Johnson. This is my property. My neighbor, Karen, is claiming that I'm somehow preventing her from using my pool. I closed it for maintenance. The officer, a middle-aged man with a stern expression, looked at me, then at Karen, then back at the pool. Ma'am, can you explain the situation from your perspective? Karen launched into her rehearsed tirade about community resources, neighborhood harmony, and my alleged discriminatory behavior. The officer listened patiently, nodding occasionally. As he listened, I noticed his expression hardening. He didn't even offer a polite smile. He wasn't dismissive of Karen like I expected. When she finished, he turned to me. Mr. Johnson, is it true that you closed the pool specifically to prevent Ms. Crawford from using it? I hesitated. Well, not specifically. I needed to do some repairs anyway, but, yes, her behavior was a factor. He frowned. Mr. Johnson, while you have the right to do what you want with your property, you also have a responsibility to be a good neighbor. Closing the pool out of spite seems unreasonable. I was stunned. Unreasonable? She's been harassing me for months. She's been trespassing on my property. She's been making my life miserable. And you're telling me I'm being unreasonable? The other officer, a younger woman, spoke up for the first time. Sir, we understand your frustration, but Ms. Crawford has a point. In the interest of community harmony, would you be willing to reconsider opening the pool? Perhaps you could establish some ground rules for its use. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They were actually taking her side. Are you serious? You're asking me to open my pool to someone who has been nothing but a nightmare? Someone who called the police on me for closing my own property? The first officer sighed. Mr. Johnson, we're just trying to find a peaceful resolution. If you refuse to cooperate, we may have to consider other options. Other options? What other options? Are you going to arrest me for closing my pool? I was incredulous. He didn't answer directly. We would prefer to avoid that, Mr. Johnson. But we also can't allow one resident to disrupt the peace and tranquility of the entire neighborhood. I looked from one officer to the other, my heart sinking. They were serious. They were actually siding with Karen, forcing me to open my pool against my will. The world felt like it was tilting on its axis. This couldn't be happening. This just couldn't be real. But it was. And in that moment, I felt a deep, profound sense of injustice. I stood there, paralyzed with disbelief, as the officers waited for my response. The silence stretched, thick with tension. I knew I was cornered. They weren't going to leave until I agreed to open the pool, and I had a feeling that if I resisted, things could get ugly. I swallowed my pride, my anger, my sense of injustice, and gave in. Fine, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I'll open the pool. Karen let out a triumphant squeal. Oh, thank you, officers. You're doing the Lord's work. The officers exchanged a look, then turned back to me. Mr. Johnson, we appreciate your cooperation. We hope this resolves the issue. They stood there as I began removing the bungee cords and pulling back the tarp, revealing the empty pool beneath. The physical act of uncovering it felt like a violation, like I was surrendering my own autonomy. Karen supervised my every move, offering unsolicited advice on how to properly clean and refill the pool. You know, you really should get a better filter, she said, her voice dripping with condescension. This one looks awfully outdated. I ignored her, focusing on the task at hand. The officers watched from a distance, occasionally exchanging words with Karen. I could feel their eyes on me, judging me, as if I were the one who had caused all this trouble. Finally, the tarp was completely removed. The empty pool stared back at me, a stark reminder of my defeat. Now came the task of refilling it, which would take hours. I started to drag out the garden hose, my movements heavy with resentment. Well, that's all we can do here, the first officer said, approaching me. We trust this will be the end of the matter. Ms. Crawford, please try to be respectful of Mr. Johnson's property. Karen nodded, her eyes gleaming with victory. Of course, officer. I'll be the perfect neighbor. The officers got back in their cruisers and drove away, leaving me alone with Karen and my empty pool. The injustice of the situation burned within me like a hot coal. I had done nothing wrong, yet I was being forced to comply with the demands of an entitled and obviously favored woman. I began filling the pool, the sound of the rushing water a constant reminder of my humiliation. Karen lingered at the fence, offering more unsolicited advice and making snide comments. I tried to block her out, but her words were like poison, seeping into my mind and fueling my anger. My hands clenched and unclenched as I fought to maintain control. I knew I couldn't let her get to me. I couldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing me lose my temper. But it was getting harder and harder to hold back. The pool was about a quarter of the way full when Karen's taunts escalated. She started making comments about my race, using derogatory terms and making assumptions about my character based on my skin color. I gritted my teeth, trying to ignore her, but her words were like knives, twisting and turning in my gut. You know, Troy, she said, her voice laced with malice, I always knew you people were just lazy and entitled. Getting all offended at the slightest thing. Now you're doing what you should have been doing anyway. I finally snapped. Karen, shut your mouth. I'm not going to listen to your racist garbage anymore. She smirked. Racist? Oh, please. You're the one who's been discriminating against me. I just wanted a little swim, and you treated me like a criminal. Get off my property, Karen, before I call the police myself, I said, my voice shaking with rage. She laughed. Go ahead, Troy. They're on my side. They know I'm the victim here. Emboldened by the police's earlier actions, Karen stepped through the gate into my yard, closing the distance between us. What are you going to do, Troy? Hit a woman. That's what your kind always do, isn't it? I stood my ground, refusing to be intimidated. I'm not going to touch you, Karen. Just get out of my yard. She leaned closer, her face inches from mine. You know, you're nothing but a... Before she could finish the sentence, she spat. The glob of saliva landed on my cheek, a disgusting, vile act of disrespect and aggression. It was the final straw. All the anger, frustration, and humiliation that had been building up inside me exploded in that moment. I raised my hand to wipe the spit from my face, but then I stopped. A new thought, a new plan, flickered in my mind. Karen, clearly expecting me to retaliate physically, recoiled, a look of triumph on her face. She knew she had pushed me too far, but she also knew that the police had seemingly given her carte blanche to act with impunity. She thought she was untouchable. She was wrong. With the spit still glistening on my cheek, I pulled out my own phone and dialed 911. This is Troy Johnson, I said, my voice surprisingly calm. I'm reporting an assault. My neighbor, Karen Crawford, just spat on me after assaulting me verbally and hurling the worst racist slurs I have ever heard. I am within my private property. The 911 operator, likely the same one Karen had spoken to earlier, sounded weary as she took my report. I gave her my address and explained what had just happened, emphasizing that Karen had spat on me. While I was on the phone, Karen continued to gloat, confident that she had won. They're not going to do anything, Troy. They know what you are. You should be happy I didn't tell them everything. She was a menace, I had to do something about this. It felt like an eternity before the police arrived, but this time, it wasn't the same two officers. Two different officers, a man and a woman, pulled up, and I explained the situation again, pointing to the saliva still drying on my cheek. I did not wipe it at all. Karen, sensing that the tide might be turning, began to backtrack, claiming that she had only spat because I had threatened her. That's a lie. I said, my voice rising. I never threatened her. She came onto my property, spewed racial slurs, and then spat on me. I have it all on camera. I said it like I knew it to be true, hoping it was. The male officer turned to Karen, his expression grim. Ma'am, is it true that you spat on Mr. Johnson? Karen hesitated, then stammered, well, yes, but he provoked me. He was being aggressive. The female officer intervened. Ma'am, spitting on someone is considered assault. We need to hear your side of the story, but you have the right to remain silent and the right to an attorney. Karen's face drained of color. The realization that she was no longer in control washed over her. The smugness vanished, replaced by a look of fear. This was new territory. After hearing both sides, the officers reviewed the footage from my security cameras, which, luckily, had captured the entire incident, including Karen's racist rant and the act of spitting. It wasn't the highest resolution, but it was clear enough. The male officer placed Karen under arrest for assault. As they led her away in handcuffs, Karen turned to me, her eyes filled with hatred. You haven't heard the last of this, Troy. I'll get you for this. I just shook my head. After they took her away, the female officer took me to the side. Sir, I apologize for the earlier officers. Their behavior was totally inappropriate and unprofessional. We will be taking this up with them, she said with a genuine tone. I nodded slowly, trying to fully comprehend what I had just heard. Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate that. What happens now? She will be charged with simple assault at the very least and possibly hate crime depending on the prosecutor. The city and the PD will be in contact for you. And if anything else like this happens, please don't hesitate to call. She handed me a card and left. The rest of the day was a blur. I finished filling the pool, but I didn't feel like swimming. The sense of triumph I expected to feel was muted by the exhaustion of the ordeal. I spent the evening talking to neighbors, who had witnessed parts of the incident. They expressed their support and disgust at Karen's behavior. Mrs. Henderson even brought over a casserole. The next morning, I received a call from the police chief, apologizing for the actions of the earlier officers and assuring me that an internal investigation was underway. He also informed me that Karen had been banned from my property and that any further attempts to contact me would result in additional charges. The story, of course, blew up. It was on the local news, then the national news, and finally, it reached Reddit. People were outraged, and many praised me for standing up to Karen. People really took my side. The pool remained open for the rest of the summer. I even invited Mrs. Henderson and some of the other neighbors over for a swim. It felt good to reclaim my space, to enjoy my property without fear or harassment. The case against Karen is still pending, but I'm hopeful that justice will be served. More than anything, I hope that this story serves as a reminder that even in the face of blatant racism and privilege, it's important to stand up for what's right. And sometimes, the wheels of justice, though slow, do eventually turn. And to those officers that took their racial favoritism into their job are soon to be unemployed. Karma is always served cold with a little bit of justice.